By the time my children read the polite little note I left for them on the mantelpiece, I, their senile and confused old mother, was already 3 states away, drinking a cup of tea and looking out at the ocean. And the house they had been so sure was theirs, it no longer existed. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Marion. My name is Marion Clark. I'm 79 years old, and I'm speaking to you from a little rented cottage on the coast of Maine. Though, for 54 years, my home was in a lovely tree-lined town in the heart of Ohio. This story, my goodness, this story is a difficult one to tell. It is the story of how my own children, the boy I raised, and the woman he married, decided I was no longer a person. How they began to see me as a problem to be managed, a set of fading faculties to be condescended to, and a collection of assets to be patiently waited for. It is a story about the quiet, soul-crushing cruelty of being erased in your own home. It is a secret I have held close for over a year. My old friends from Ohio, the women from my bridge club, my neighbors, they don't know the whole truth. They know I sold my house and moved away suddenly. I think they assume it was for my health or to be closer to some non-existent, distant relative. I let them believe that. How do you tell the women you've known your whole life that your son and his wife treated you with such profound, dismissive contempt, that your only path to freedom was to vanish? The shame of it, it's a specific kind of shame, you see. It's not the sharp shame of a single, terrible act. It's the dull, aching shame of 1,000 tiny cuts, 1,000 moments of being talked over, of being ignored, of having your own memories explained back to you, as if they were a child's fantasy. You start to feel it seeping into your bones. You start to believe them. You start to wonder if your mind truly is failing, if you truly are the burden they so lovingly, so patiently imply that you are. It is a poison. And for a long time, I drank it down, because I thought it was my duty as a mother to protect my children from the truth of their own ugliness. But I am too old to carry their poison anymore. I am telling my story now because I need to. I need to set the record straight, if only for myself. And I am telling it for anyone out there who has ever felt their voice getting quieter, who has ever felt themselves starting to fade in a room full of people who are supposed to love them the most. Before I begin this journey, I would be so very grateful for your kindness. My hands are trembling just a little, thinking about laying all this bare. Please, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is more than just a number to me. It is a quiet validation, a little light in the dark that makes me feel seen, and it gives this old woman the strength to finally tell the story of how she decided to become visible again. Thank you, my dears. Thank you for that. My life, for 54 years, was a partnership with my husband, my Arthur. He was not a poet or a captain of industry. He was a civil engineer. A good one. He was a man of numbers, and blueprints, and things that were built to last. He was a practical, steady, and deeply honorable man. Our life was not a grand adventure. It was something quieter, and I think, something better. It was a life of contented partnership, of shared responsibilities, of building a small, safe, and deeply cherished world, brick by brick. He bought this house for us, our little 2-story colonial on a street lined with maple trees, the year our son David was born. It was a simple builder-grade house then, but over the next 50 years, it became our canvas. Arthur was the planner, the architect of our small world. He was the one who could see the potential in things. "You see, Marion?" he'd say, his face alight with a quiet, focused passion. "The drainage here is all wrong, but if we build a retaining wall, right here, with a proper French drain, we can level this whole section. We can have a proper garden, a real one." I didn't know the first thing about French drains, but I knew how to mix mortar. So we built that wall together. Every weekend for an entire summer. My hands were rough with calluses, my back ached, but as I watched that wall rise, brick by brick, I felt a sense of pride, of ownership that I had never known. We didn't just build a wall, we built a foundation. Our life was a collection of those projects. The bookshelves he built in the den, where every shelf was perfectly level, every joint a masterpiece of quiet precision. The brick patio out back, where he taught me how to lay the sand and set the bricks in a perfect herringbone pattern. The vegetable garden that I tended, which, thanks to his brilliant compost system, produced more tomatoes than we could ever eat. This house wasn't just a structure to us, it was a testament to our partnership. Every corner held a memory of a problem solved, of a thing built together. Arthur was the planner in all things, especially our finances. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he was a prudent one. He would sit at the kitchen table every Sunday evening with his ledger book and his calculator. It wasn't a secret from me. It was a shared ritual. He taught me how to balance a checkbook, how to read a bank statement, how to understand the quiet, powerful magic of compound interest. "You have to know this, Marion," he would always say, tapping the ledger with his pen. "A woman should never be a stranger to her own money. You need to know how it works. You need to know where it is. You are my partner, in all things. This too." He was not a man who believed in secrets. He believed in knowledge. He believed in preparedness. He made sure I understood every investment, every insurance policy, every detail of the will. He made sure I was not just his wife. I was his executor, his equal partner, fully capable of managing our small but secure world without him. He was a good and thoughtful teacher. It was a lesson that, years later, would become my salvation. He was preparing me for a battle he never could have imagined I would have to fight. We had one child, our son, David. Oh, he was a sweet boy, the joy of our lives. But he was not like his father. He had my love of books and his father's kind heart, but he had none of Arthur's practical, methodical nature. David is a man who avoids details. He finds them tedious. He is a high school English teacher. He lives in a world of metaphors and grand themes, not a world of numbers and logistics. He is a good man, but a man who has always been content to let someone else handle the boring stuff. For the first 30 years of his life, that someone was his father. And then, it was his wife. And then, 10 years ago, David brought Susan home. And my goodness, she was a whirlwind of competent energy. She was an office manager at a large dental practice, a woman who lived by the motto, "If you want something done right, you do it yourself." She was pretty, she was cheerful, she was organized, and she adored my David. Or rather, she adored the idea of managing him. She saw his gentle, slightly impractical nature not as a flaw, but as a project. A handsome, charming project she could organize into a perfect life. The first time she came for Sunday dinner, she walked through my house, and her compliments were not about its beauty, but about its upkeep. "Oh, Marion, this house is just so well maintained," she'd said, running a hand over the fireplace mantel. "The woodwork is in perfect condition, and your garden, it's so productive. Arthur must have been a wonderful planner." She didn't see the love. She didn't see the memories. She saw a well-maintained asset. She saw good planning. That should have been my first clue. My son, of course, was smitten. He was so proud of her. He loved her efficiency, her confidence, her ability to take charge of all the little boring details of life that he so disliked. He could live in his world of poetry, and she would handle the logistics. They were, in that way, a perfect match. I liked her. I truly did. I was so happy that my son had found a strong, capable partner. I thought Arthur would have approved of her practicality, of her organizational skills. I welcomed her into my home, into my family, with an open and trusting heart. I didn't realize that she saw my home, not as a place of love and memory to be cherished, but as the final, ultimate organizational project. And she was just waiting, patiently, for the current manager to retire, so she could take over. After my Arthur passed away 5 years ago, the house became quiet. Too quiet. The steady, comforting rhythm of his presence was gone, and the silence he left behind was a heavy, physical thing. I had my garden, my books, my friends. I was lonely, but I was not helpless. I knew how to pay a bill. I knew how to balance a checkbook. I knew how to manage the small, safe world Arthur and I had built. I was the capable, quiet manager of my own life. But that was not the story Susan wanted to tell. In the first few months after the funeral, she and David were wonderful. They were a constant, comforting presence. Susan, in her supremely competent way, took charge. She organized the casseroles that came flooding in from our kind neighbors. She answered the phone. She made sure I was eating. She was a whirlwind of helpful, efficient sympathy. And I, in my fog of grief, was so deeply, deeply grateful. It was during this time that she began her quiet, subtle takeover. It started, as I imagine it so often does, with the finances. It was not a hostile coup. It was a gentle, loving, and utterly insidious offer of help. "Oh, Marion, honey," she began, her voice a soft, gentle murmur. She came and stood behind my chair, her hands resting on my shoulders. "You shouldn't be worrying about all this right now. Not while you're grieving. It's too much." "Anini, I'm all right, dear," I said, my voice a little weary. "Arthur always taught me how to handle these things." "I know he did," she said, her voice so full of admiration. "He was the most organized man I have ever met. But you are grieving. You need to rest. You need to heal." She picked up a bill from the table. "Please, let me do this for you. Let me just take this one burden off your shoulders. I can set everything up on automatic payments. You'll never have to worry about a due date again. It's what Arthur would want. He would want you to be taken care of." Her logic was flawless. Her tone was so full of love. How could I say no? To refuse would have felt ungrateful, churlish. And so, I agreed. I showed her how to access the accounts. I gave her the passwords. I handed over the keys to my small, secure financial kingdom. I thought I was accepting a kindness. I didn't realize I was setting control. With access to my finances, she now had the perfect tool to begin building her narrative. The narrative of my gentle, but undeniable, decline. It started with small, deniable acts of helpfulness. She started doing my grocery shopping. "Oh, it's no trouble. I'm going anyway," she'd insist. But when I'd look in the refrigerator, my favorite brand of orange juice would be gone, replaced by a different one. The bread I liked was replaced by a healthier, whole grain version she preferred. When I would mention it, she'd look at me with a small, confused frown. "But Marion, this is the bread you asked for," she'd say, her voice full of certainty. "Don't you remember? You told me last week you wanted to start eating healthier." And I, for a moment, would be lost. Did I say that? I don't remember saying that. But perhaps I did. My mind has been so foggy lately. I would find myself apologizing to her for my own confusion. She was a master of it. She was like a quiet, persistent artist, painting a new reality over my old one small brushstroke at a time. My son, my dear David, was the unwitting canvas for her masterpiece. She would report my lapses to him, her voice always full of a deep, loving concern. "David, honey," she'd say, her brow furrowed. "I'm getting a little worried about your mom. I had to pay one of her bills today, and I noticed she'd already paid it last week. She's paying things twice. She can't keep track anymore." Of course, I had not paid it twice. I had paid it once, the week before, as I always did. She had then helpfully paid it again from my online account. But she didn't tell him that part. She just presented the evidence of the double payment. The evidence of my confusion. David would then call me, his voice heavy with a sad, worried love. "Mom, are you doing okay? Susan told me about the electric bill. Please, you have to let her handle these things. It's too much for you to keep track of." I was being gently, lovingly, trapped in a web of their shared concern. My reality was being invalidated, my competence questioned, all under the guise of protecting me. To fight back, to argue, would only have made me look difficult, ungrateful, and worst of all, confused. It would have proved their point. So, I did what so many women of my generation were taught to do. I swallowed my frustration. I kept the peace. The next stage of her campaign was the direct assault on my mind, on my memories. My home was a repository of my life with Arthur. Every object held a story. And Susan, my new family historian, began to correct them. We would be sitting in the living room, and I would point to a small, slightly dented silver trophy on the mantelpiece. You know, I'd say to my grandson, who was playing on the floor, "Your Grandpa Arthur won that trophy for his roses at the State Fair in 1982. And Susan would jump in with a bright, gentle, corrective laugh. "Oh, Marion, you silly goose. That wasn't the State Fair. That was the county fair. And it was 1983. Don't you remember? We have the photograph in the album. You always get those 2 years mixed up." She was so certain, so confident. And the details were so small, so insignificant. What did it matter if it was the state fair or the county fair? But it did matter. Because with every small correction, she was chipping away at my authority over my own life story. She was telling me, and my son, and my grandson, that my memories were unreliable. That she, the newcomer, was the true keeper of our family's history. She was slowly, methodically, building a case against me. She was creating a file of my senility, a collection of charming anecdotes that all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Marion is a dear, sweet woman, but she is losing her mind. She is no longer capable of managing her own life. And I, in my grief, in my desire to keep the peace, in my love for my son, I let her. I retreated. I became quieter. I stopped telling my stories because I was tired of having them corrected. I began to feel like a visitor in my own home, a guest in my own life. I was fading. I was becoming the person she wanted me to be. A sweet, forgetful, and utterly powerless old woman. I didn't realize that was the entire point. I didn't realize that she wasn't just collecting anecdotes. She was preparing her case for a hostile takeover. And the asset she intended to acquire was my house. With the narrative of my incompetence firmly established, with my own son convinced that I was a dear but fading woman who needed constant management, Susan began the final phase of her campaign. She had successfully taken over my finances and my history. Now she came for my home. It began, as her campaigns always did, under the guise of loving concern. She started talking about the house as a burden. "Oh, Marion," she would sigh, looking around my clean, well-organized kitchen. "This house is just so much work for you. All the dusting, the vacuuming, the yard work. You should be relaxing, enjoying your retirement, not worrying about all this." Vanish. She was framing my independence as a chore. The simple, pleasant tasks of keeping my own home, the rhythms that had structured my life for 50 years, were now being presented as a heavy weight I was no longer capable of carrying. Her next move was to suggest improvements. Modernizations that would, of course, make the house safer and easier to manage. "You know, Marion," she'd say, her voice full of bright, helpful energy, "this wallpaper is so pretty, but it's starting to peel in the corners. And old wallpaper can hold so much dust. It can't be good for your allergies. We should really think about taking it down, putting on a nice, clean coat of neutral paint. It would be so much healthier." Aging. She wasn't just suggesting a design change. She was suggesting that my very home was a danger to my health. The subtext was always the same. This place, in its current state, is not safe for a frail old woman like you. I would politely refuse. "Thank you, dear, but I quite like the wallpaper. It was the first thing your father-in-law and I picked out together. Dege, and every adventure to." And she would sigh that patient, weary sigh, the sigh of a competent woman dealing with a sentimental, stubborn child. "Of course," she would say. "I understand." But I could see the flash of frustration in her eyes. Every refusal to modernize was a small act of defiance that she could then report back to my son as further evidence of my irrationality. "I tried to talk to her about making the stairs safer, David," I overheard her telling him one night. "Putting in a new, modern banister. But she won't have it. She's so attached to these old things, she's not thinking about her own safety. And me. He was a man caught in an impossible position. He loved me, but he adored his wife. And his wife's arguments were always so logical, so reasonable, so full of concern. How could he argue against making things safer for his own mother? He couldn't. So he would just fall silent, and his silence was her victory. The final, brutal, and soul-crushing confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon. It was a beautiful day in early autumn. I was in my garden, happily digging up my potatoes, one of the few simple pleasures I still had that she had not yet managed to control. She and David came out onto the back patio. They were holding coffee mugs, and they had a look on their faces that I had come to dread. It was the look of a united, loving front about to deliver a very difficult but necessary piece of bad news. "Mom," David began, his voice heavy with a rehearsed sorrow. "Can we talk to you for a minute?" I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. I knew this was it. This was the moment her entire 2-year campaign had been building towards. "Susan and I have been talking," he continued, not quite meeting my eyes. "And we have been doing a lot of thinking. About the future. About what's best for you." Susan stepped forward and took my hand. Her hand was warm, but her grip was like steel. Her face was a perfect mask of loving, pained sympathy. "Marion," she said, her voice a low, gentle murmur. "We love you so much, and we are so worried about this house. It's too much for you. We see how tired you are. We see you forgetting things. We see you stumbling." A lie. I hadn't stumbled once. And we cannot, in good conscience, live with the constant fear that something is going to happen to you here, all alone. I just stared at her, my own hand limp in her grasp. "So," she continued, taking a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a great act of loving sacrifice. "We have found the perfect solution. A way for you to be safe and cared for, and to have a whole new community of friends. A way for you to finally, truly retire." She presented me with a glossy, colorful brochure. The cover read, "The Willows at Chestnut Hill, Gracious Senior Living." It was a nursing home. An expensive, beautifully landscaped, and utterly soul-crushing nursing home. "It's the best one in the state, Mom," my son said, his voice pleading. "It's like a 5-star hotel. They have a pool. They have a movie theater. They have wonderful doctors on staff, 24/7. You will be so safe there. So happy." I looked at the pictures in the brochure. Pictures of smiling, silver-haired people playing bingo. Pictures of tidy, sterile, beige rooms. I looked at their faces, my son and his wife, their eyes full of a righteous, loving certainty that they were doing the right thing. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It turned to stone. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of a frail, confused old woman. It was the voice of a stranger. It was the voice of a woman who had finally had enough. Susan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Now, Marion," she began, in her patient, condescending tone. "Let's not be hasty. I know this is a big change, but—" "I said no," I repeated, pulling my hand from her grasp. I looked directly at my son. "This is my home, David. The home your father and I built. The home where you grew up. The home where your father died. I am not leaving it. Not now. Not ever." And then Susan, my patient, loving daughter-in-law, finally lost her patience. The mask dropped, and I saw the cold, hard, grasping greed that had been hiding underneath it all along. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Marion, stop being so sentimental and childish," she snapped, her voice sharp and ugly. "This isn't about you anymore. It's about us. It's about our future. We cannot be expected to put our lives on hold indefinitely, waiting for you to fade away. This house is a huge asset, just sitting here, depreciating. David is the rightful heir. It is his house. and we have decided that the best way to manage this asset is to sell it. His house. There it was. The truth. Edmasto. The ugly, naked, and brutal truth. The house was not my home. It was an asset. I was not a mother. I was an obstacle. An obstacle to their future, to their inheritance. I looked at my son. "Is this true, David?" I asked, my voice a dead, empty whisper. "Is this what you believe?" He couldn't look at me. He just stared at the ground, a portrait of miserable, spineless shame. "It makes sense, Mom," he mumbled. "Financially, it's the logical thing to do. We could invest the money. It would be better for everyone in the long run. Better for everyone." I stood there in my own garden, covered in the dirt I loved, and I looked at the two people who were supposed to be my family. The two people who were calmly, logically discussing the liquidation of my life. And I finally understood. They had already decided. I was already gone. They were just waiting for my body to catch up with their decision. I was a ghost in my own garden. A senile old woman, whose only remaining purpose was to sign the papers and then, politely, fade away. A strange and terrible calm settled over me. The anger, the grief, the heartbreak. It all receded, replaced by a single cold and diamond-hard thought. "You think I am senile," I thought, looking at their determined, pitying faces. "You think I am a confused, powerless old woman. You think this house is yours. Find it wine." The war was over. I had lost. But the terms of my surrender would be my own. And they would be a surprise. I stood there in my garden for a long time after they went back inside. I could feel the warmth of the autumn sun on my back. I could smell the rich, earthy scent of the soil. And I could hear the distant, happy sound of children playing in a nearby yard. The world was still turning. My heart was still beating. I was not, I realized with a sudden fierce clarity, dead yet. They thought they had won. They had presented their terms, and in my silence they had seen my surrender. But they had made a classic, fatal mistake. The mistake of every arrogant victor. They had underestimated the vanquished. They saw a frail, sentimental old woman. They did not see the woman who had helped her brilliant engineer husband build this house from the foundation up. They did not see the woman who had sat beside him for 50 years, learning the quiet, powerful language of numbers and plans and logistics. They did not see the woman he had so carefully, so lovingly, prepared for a battle he never knew she would have to fight. In that moment, a plan began to form in my mind. It was not a plan of anger or of loud, messy confrontation. That was their way, not mine. My plan would be quiet. It would be methodical. It would be built with the same patient, steady precision with which Arthur and I had built the garden wall, brick by brick. They wanted to erase my life. Fine. But I would be the one to choose the time, the place, and the terms of my own disappearance. My fight back began that very evening. It began with an act of complete and total surrender. I found them in the living room. They were watching television, a picture of domestic tranquility. They looked up as I entered, their faces wary, expecting another emotional outburst. But I gave them none. I gave them only defeat. "You're right," I said, my voice a soft, trembling whisper. I did not sit down. I stood before them like a supplicant. "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. I've been selfish, sentimental." They exchanged a quick, triumphant look. "This house, it is too much for me," I continued, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "And it is your inheritance. It is your future. You should not have to wait for it. You should not have to wait for me." I let my voice break on the last word. If selling it is the logical thing to do, if it is what's best for the family, then that is what we must do. Susan's face flooded with a look of profound, victorious relief. She stood up and came to me, wrapping me in a hug that felt like a cage. "Oh, Marion," she said, her voice dripping with a false, cloying sympathy. "I knew you would understand. This is so brave of you, so selfless. It is the right decision." The performance of her life, I thought. And now begins the performance of mine. From that day forward, I was the perfect, compliant, and gently fading matriarch. I agreed to everything. I let them call a real estate agent, a slick, fast-talking young woman who was a friend of Susan's. I watched, with a quiet, sad smile, as she walked through my home, not seeing its memories, but calculating its commission. I let them talk to me about the willows at Chestnut Hill. I looked at the glossy brochures, and I listened to their descriptions of the watercolor classes and the gentle yoga. "It sounds lovely, dear," I would say. "So safe." I was lulling them into a state of absolute security. They saw a woman who had been beaten, who had accepted her fate. They did not see the woman who was now spending her afternoons at the local library, not in the fiction section, but in the legal and financial reference aisle. They did not see the woman who was making quiet, discreet phone calls from the payphone at the back of the grocery store. My first call was to my husband's old lawyer, Mr. Fields. He was long retired, but his mind was as sharp as ever. I told him everything. He listened in a long, pained silence. "Arthur always said you were the strong one, Marion," he'd said when I was done. "He said you were the steel in his foundation." It seems he was right. My second call was to a woman Mr. Fields had recommended. A real estate agent. Not a friend of Susan's. A shark. A woman named Ms. Peters, who was known for her discretion, her speed, and her ability to close a deal with ruthless efficiency. My plan was very simple. It had two parts. First, I had to legally and quietly transfer the ownership of the house, my house, without my children's knowledge. Mr. Fields explained how it could be done. Under the guise of estate planning, I could create a private family trust, and I could then transfer the deed of the house to that trust. And I, of course, would be the sole trustee. It was a simple, legal maneuver, a quiet shifting of papers in a downtown office that would be completely invisible to the two people who were so busy planning the sale of a property they did not, in fact, have the legal authority to sell. The second part of the plan was the more difficult one. It required a level of emotional duplicity that went against my very nature. But I knew it was necessary. I had to ensure that when I made my final move, they would not be able to stop me. I had to let them believe, until the very last moment, that they were in complete control. I told them I wanted to have one last family Christmas in the house. "Just one last one," I said, my voice full of a gentle, nostalgic sadness. "For the memories. We can have the whole family. We can put the tree up in the bay window just like we always did. And then, after the holidays, we can sign the papers. For the house, for the willows. We can begin the new year with a fresh start." It was the perfect bait, and they took it without a moment's hesitation. It appealed to their sense of magnanimity. Of course, they would grant the sentimental old woman her one last wish. It was a small price to pay for the fortune that was waiting for them in January. So, they agreed. The sale would wait until after the new year. And all the while, in the quiet afternoons while they were at work, I began my own secret, methodical work. The house was not just a collection of memories. It was a lifetime of accumulated possessions. And I, the woman who was supposedly too confused to manage her own life, began the great, secret, and deeply satisfying task of dismantling it. I started in the attic. The boxes of David's old schoolwork, the photographs, the family heirlooms. I hired a discreet moving and storage company, a company recommended by Miss Peters. Two quiet, strong young men would arrive in a plain, unmarked van. And piece by piece, box by box, my life, my history, was quietly removed from the house and put into a secure, climate-controlled storage unit, a unit that was rented in a name that was not my own. I was not just selling a house. I was planning an escape, an evaporation. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, long before I intended to vanish completely. They were so busy planning my future, they never once noticed that I was quietly, methodically erasing my past. And their inheritance along with it. That last Christmas in the house was the most surreal performance of my life. I played the part of the happy, sentimental matriarch, enjoying her final holiday in her beloved home. I baked the cookies. I hung the stockings. I smiled at my grandson as he tore open his presents with joyous abandon. On the surface, it was a perfect Christmas card, a beautiful, final memory. But underneath, I was a general, quietly moving my troops into position for the final, decisive battle. Every box of ornaments I packed away after the holidays was another piece of my history secured. Every dish I washed and put away was a final goodbye. I was a ghost, haunting my own life, carefully curating what would be left behind. Susan and David were magnificent in their roles as well. They were pictures of patient, loving forbearance. They endured my nostalgic stories. They complimented my cooking. They were so kind, so accommodating, because they knew the prize was just weeks away. They looked at me, and they saw a finish line. They saw a pot of gold at the end of a long, tiresome rainbow. The politeness in that house was so thick, so false you could have cut it with a knife. The day after New Year's, the last of the decorations were packed away. The house felt empty. Bare Reiners. Stripped of its joy. The stage was set. On a cold gray Tuesday in January, the day of the scheduled signing, I woke up before dawn. My secret preparations were complete. Over the past month, my quiet, efficient movers had taken the last of my life from that house. The storage unit held my photographs, my mother's china, my husband's books, my quilts. Everything that mattered. The house now held nothing but furniture, dishes, and 50 years of ghosts. I went to my husband's old desk. I took out a piece of my best cream-colored stationery, and I wrote a note. It was not an angry note. It was not a sad note. It was a polite note. A note of simple, clear, and devastating instructions. My dearest David and Susan, I wrote. Thank you for a lovely, final Christmas in this house. As we discussed, the time has come for me to begin my new chapter. As such, I have decided to leave a little earlier than planned. You were so right. This house is a huge asset. And as the sole trustee of the Arthur Clark Family Trust, which now holds the title to this property, I've made a decision that I believe is in the best interest of the trust. I have accepted a cash offer for the house from a private buyer. The sale closed yesterday. The new owners will be arriving this afternoon to take possession of the property. I have left the furniture and dishes for them, as a gesture of goodwill. I am sure you will want to have all of your personal belongings removed from the premises before they arrive. I wish you both all the best in your future endeavors. Love, Mother. No. I placed the note in an envelope, and I propped it up on the mantelpiece, right in the center, where they could not possibly miss it. My final act was a phone call to the one person I knew I could trust. My taxi driver, a kind man named Mr. Henderson, who had driven me to the library so many times. I had arranged it with him the week before. I'm ready, Mr. Henderson, I said when he answered. 15 minutes later, as the winter sun was beginning to rise, a yellow taxi pulled up to the curb. I walked out of my front door for the last time, carrying only a single small suitcase and my purse. I did not look back. I got into the taxi. The train station, please, Mr. Henderson, I said. And as we drove away, down the quiet, tree-lined street, I felt a sense of peace so profound, so absolute, it was like taking my first breath after being underwater for a very, very long time. I was free. I can only imagine the scene. I had played it in my mind 1,000 times. They would have walked in, calling my name, expecting to find me, their frail, confused mother, waiting to be taken to my new life. They would have found the house silent, empty. And then, they would have seen it. The single, cream-colored envelope, sitting on the mantelpiece like a final, quiet judgment. I can imagine Susan's sharp, impatient sigh as she opened it. I can imagine her eyes scanning the polite, simple words. I can imagine the moment her brain finally processed their meaning. The confusion. The dawning, horrified disbelief. The sale closed yesterday. The new owners will be arriving this afternoon. I can imagine the sound of her strangled gasp. I can imagine her thrusting the note at my son, his own slow, painful journey through the words. I can imagine the moment of pure, unadulterated panic. The frantic phone calls to the real estate agent, who would of course confirm that the house was no longer for sale because it had already been sold. The call to the lawyer, who would confirm that the title was held in a trust to which they had no access. They had been so sure. So arrogant. They thought they were holding all the cards. They never stopped to consider that I might have a hand of my own to play. I received one phone call. It was from my son. He was screaming. He was crying. He was yelling. A long, incoherent tirade of rage and disbelief, and a pain so deep, it was almost beautiful. He asked me how I could do this to them. How I could be so cruel. I am not the one who was cruel, David, I said, my voice calm and quiet. I simply took you at your word. You said the house was an asset to be managed. You said selling it was the logical thing to do. I am an old woman, and I have decided to simplify my life. So I did the logical thing. I managed my asset. He had no answer to that. The new owners of my old house are a young family, with 2 small children. My realtor, the wonderful, shark-like Ms. Peters, told me they were thrilled to find all the furniture still there. They sent me a thank you note. My son and I, we are not speaking, for now. The wound is too deep. The betrayal, on both sides, is too raw. Perhaps one day he will understand. Perhaps one day he will be able to see me not as a problem or an asset, but simply as his mother. I hope so. But I'm not waiting by the phone. I have learned that being old is not the same as being foolish. I have learned that being quiet is not the same as being weak. And I have learned that when someone builds a cage for you, made of their expectations and their dismissiveness, you do not have to live in it. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to simply, quietly, and politely walk out the door and build a new life of your own. You just have to be willing to leave the old one behind. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. It is, I hope, a reminder that it is never too late to start a new chapter. If this story has resonated with you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and press that little notification bell so you don't miss what's next. And in the comments below, please feel free to share a story about a time you found the courage to make a fresh start. Love you all. This is Grandma Marion, and I'll see you in the next story.